Hello, everybody. Jeffrey Bartell here, and back there is my dog Digger. And today I'm going to be doing a reaction video. Today is September 16th, which is also Mayflower Day, but it's not just any ordinary Mayflower Day. It's the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Day. which makes it a special occasion. So we're going to learn So for this reaction video, we're going to learn the history of it through. We're going to learn the history through via YouTube video by Timeline World History Documentaries. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Something doesn't hold on. Something doesn't feel right. So please hang on. I had to make sure my videos weren't out of sync. Audio or video is out of sync. You know what I mean. All right. So counting down. Let's get started. 3, 2, 1. Begin. All right, let's see what you got for us. And Snow History Hit Live on Timeline. Bringing the classroom to your front room. History Hit.
Welcome to a very special episode of History Hit Live. I am here in Britain's maritime city, Plymouth in southwest England, because it was here 400 years ago today that one of the most famous ships in history, the Mayflower, set sail from that port just there and headed out to sea on its way across the Atlantic. This is a commemoration as never before. This is an honest and inclusive look at the consequences of the Mayflower journey for people here in Europe, for the people on the ship, and for the people in North America when they arrived. This is a story of colonization, settlement, and oppression, but also of humanity, migration, heroism, and a thirst for freedom. This is one of the most important journeys in history.
Mayflower 400. Beyond the journey.
The story of the Mayflower is one that's been mythologized and misunderstood for generations. All too often it's been thought of as a journey of a single ship from here. 65 days later they arrive in North America. The men on board remembered as pilgrim fathers, but for example we now know the ship was full of women and children as well. Their story is being researched and told. But what about the people that are already living in North America, had been there for millennia? They have been overlooked and written out of the story. So we're going to start today's journey by taking a look at the Americas and the people that live there already.
North America.
So pre-European contact, which would have been well before the Mayflower had come over, because there had been quite a bit of contact with European explorers and traders prior to the early 1600s. But prior to that, you know, I really like to think that it was a really idyllic setting for my ancestors to be in. They did live very much in tune with nature. They took what nature gave, and they, you know, lived by the water in the summer, and they moved further inland in the winter, following the food sources, living in home styles that were efficient for the weather as well. And they also as well had a very structured form of government. And we know this because when the Europeans did start to come over, they did realize that there was an organization behind it, and there was a way for the people to live in harmony. And they had a structure of government that worked very well for them. We also know as well that a lot of the diseases and sicknesses that the Europeans had been dealing with were not something that we had here. Those were all introduced in the 1600s, and they were very difficult for the tribes because they ripped through in very fast fashion. So I do like to look back and think that it was mostly an idyllic way of life for my ancestors prior to the Europeans coming over.
A continent teeming with life, a far cry from the image of a new world peopled by a few uncivilized savages. Anyway, speaking of savages, let's check in with what's going on in Europe at the time.
So Europe at that time, in the 1500s and the 1600s, there's an awful lot going on. There's a lot of changes happening, religious changes, political changes, changes in authority and power, and a lot of that stems from the Reformation. It's quite a turbulent time, there's a lot of turmoil, and it also causes lots of conflict, so things are quite unsettled.
400 years ago, Europe was a place of extraordinary religious division and tension. There were competing ideas about how they should worship God. Catholics, of course, disagreed with the Protestants, but even within Protestantism, there were various groups. Evangelicals, known as Puritans, came to regard Anglicanism as an abomination, with its candles, its gaudy finery and paintings on the walls of churches. They wanted a much
Dang commercials.
Don't you love keeping your ride clean and protected? Then check this shit out.
simpler way to commune with God.
It's quite easy to talk about the church and religious views and think of it perhaps as something that's separate. Sometimes it is separate for people today. Church is something that some people do, but not everybody does it. Back then, everybody had to go to church. It was the law, and you had to go to your local church. You weren't allowed to go to a different church, perhaps in a different village if you were living in a village. That was called gadding about if you went to somebody else's church, and you weren't meant to do it. And you could be fined if you broke some of these church rules. So your beliefs, your religion, was part of your everyday life. Within the Protestant tradition, there are the Puritans who have clearer ideas about wanting to get rid of some of the rituals that they saw as associated with the Catholic Church. They wanted things to be quite plain and simple. But the separatists, those people who want to separate themselves from the church, are probably further along in that spectrum. So I suppose you could describe them as more extreme. And they took the decision in the end that actually you can't stay within the church and try and change it from within. You just want to be out of it completely, which is an issue when you start to think about who the head of the church is. As it is now, the head of the Church of England is the monarch. If you are in charge of that church and there are people who reject that hierarchy or who don't agree with it, then they are effectively challenging your authority. Your authority is head of the church, but your authority is head of the state, which is potentially dangerous.
It's interesting. I mean, the word Puritan, like lots of words, it starts as an insult. And gets proudly, used and adopted by the Puritans themselves. There isn't a very clear ideological difference which separates Puritans from other Protestants. It's more the intensity of their belief, the fact that the Bible, infuses their every thought, their every word. There are certain aspects of certain things that they believed.
So they objected to things like wearing particular robes, which they were required to wear, and they didn't want to make the sign of the cross at baptism, for example. And so they could be fined. You could be fined for not going to church, going to the wrong church, preaching in a church if you didn't have permission to do that. So only particular people were allowed to do that. You had to have had the right kind of training and education to be allowed to speak to people about God. And so the people who were starting to object to that were breaking those rules, and they were talking, preaching to people, not necessarily always in the context of churches. So they were starting to do those things in their own homes as well, and that's where some of the risks would have developed. So it's thought that William Brewster, who became known as an elder of the Pilgrims, who went to America, it's thought that he had a group who would meet in his home, which was Scrooby Manor in North Nottinghamshire. There was another congregation formed in Gainsborough. John Smith was the leader of that group, and it's thought that they may have met in Gainsborough Old Hall also to worship in secret. Where you start to see problems for the separatists are where people are saying so-and-so's doing this and they shouldn't be doing it, and then they get in trouble with the church courts, they could be fined, they could be imprisoned, and in some of the more urban areas, in the period not long before, people were being executed.
They were hoping that King James I would allow them to worship in their own way, but he proved to be an opponent of theirs. They felt persecuted. They would need to set up their promised land somewhere else.
I think sometimes we really focus on this Atlantic journey and the 66 days from Plymouth to landing in what became Provincetown. But I think what we have to remember is that for all of these passengers, their journey began before that, either in Holland or in London or in other places. So actually they've been travelling for a very, very long time.
A few of them got on a barge on the River Trent to sail up the Trent to the Humber, across to Stallingborough to get on a Dutch ship to escape to Amsterdam.
They lived in tenement houses by canals, which were described as being, subject to stinking. They were, these were kind of very polluted.
Hi, I'm Jesse. And this is Flo.
And we are Real Time History. Over the past 6 years, we have been covering the First World War and its aftermath in over 700 episodes over on our YouTube channel, The Great War, a project that would have never been possible on traditional TV.
And we also crowdfunded our World War II documentary series, 16 Days in Berlin, with the help of over 4,000 supporters from around the world. And it was released earlier this year on the 75th anniversary of the battle.
Today, we are back to work with you again. We are making a documentary about one of the most decisive, yet often overlooked World War II battles in the West. We are covering the Battle of the Rhineland.
In 1945, British, Canadian, and American troops launched a massive assault on the German army's final line of defense in the West, the mighty Rhine River. There was bitter fighting in the mud and in the forests, and finally, a massive airborne assault to open the way into northern Germany.
We'll cover the fighting on the ground, in the air, and on the river, with original battle footage, unreleased material, and sources from all sides, of course. We have access to the battlefields and will work with an international team of historians and experts to cover the brutal combat and the plight of the civilians caught up in the crossfire.
And while researching the battle, I recently learned that my very own grandfather also participated in the Rhineland campaign, which he didn't talk about very much. He was a machine gunner with the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, and his story is just one of the many personal stories that we will bring to you in this documentary.
We need your support to make Rhineland 45 a reality. No TV station or broadcaster would allow us to make such an ambitious, in-depth documentary about the war. We want to show history as it really was, and with YouTube's content restrictions, we would never be able to release it there.
With your help, we can once again bring together our expert team and make sure that we can preserve the history and the legacy of this crucial battle.
Here at the Tank Museum, we're going to be supporting Rhineland 45 with vehicles such as this Comet. We're going to be helping tell that story of that amazing set of battles that led to the invasion of the German heartland in World War II.
We have prepared a range of rewards that we think you will really like, and you can choose the one that works best for you. Every pledge is important because it sends a message to traditional media that if they don't want to cover history in the level of depth that it deserves, we will just do it ourselves.
So help us do this together, and please pledge right now. Thank you so much for your support.
Quite unpleasant kind of places to live at the time. The émigré community in Leiden grew to be about 500 strong.
One of the other attractions of Leiden for some of the leading men is the fact that it's got the university there. So they can become involved in teaching. William Brewster is involved in setting up his printing press. Not necessarily to make money, but because they're interested in spreading the word of what they believe and promoting the kind of arguments that they want to continue having. They're actually in Holland for 12 years before they go to America, and so they start to feel that their children are becoming a bit too Dutch. They see themselves very much still as English. I think they have that identity as English people. And they are also a bit concerned about some of the other beliefs that people have. So you're in a place that perhaps is more liberal, and people are tolerated for their different practices. And Leiden is known as the city of migrants. There are lots of people that travel to Leiden from all different areas, and so there are these different churches and different traditions. But it seems as though the pilgrims themselves that are not very tolerant of some of these other practices, which is quite ironic because they are all about wanting religious tolerance for themselves, but they aren't necessarily tolerant of how other people do things. People are starting then at that time to talk about going to this new world.
They were really aware of the earlier colonies that had been settled in North America. And we know this because they write about it in the first publication that they write, March Relation. So they know what's happened in Jamestown, and they know that Jamestown has the only successful English colony in the North American landscape at this time.
There is an opportunity to set yourself up as a new community and perhaps have a bit more autonomy. That becomes an attractive idea to the pilgrims. They want this religious tolerance, but they effectively don't want to be influenced by other people or have their children around other people who they don't necessarily agree with.
They understood that there are different ways to settle colonies, and Jamestown, being the only success story that they were aware of, was the model that they would have to depend upon. And interestingly, one of the passengers on the Mayflower, Stephen Hopkins, had been to Jamestown, so he's already made the transatlantic journey already, and he's brought in by the merchant adventurers, I guess, to help the colonists.
Setting up colonies was a way of increasing economic opportunities for people back in those cities. They were looking for groups who would be willing to do that, but they were giving them terms which were sometimes quite onerous. So the pilgrims did get themselves involved in a deal which was a 7-year debt, effectively. They had 7 years to pay back the debt from them being set up to be able to go over to America.
So we think the crew of Mayflower were drawn from this community?
I would have thought so, largely, yes. They would have lived in the area. Some of them may have come from different places.
But we think the captain was a worshipper here?
We think so, yes. He was certainly married here.
The captain, Christopher Jones, lived in Rotherhithe. Where exactly the rest of the crew lived, I mean, we don't even know exactly how many crew members there were, but around about 30 is plausible.
This chalice bears a very important date. I don't know whether you can see it or whether you can show it to the camera.
Domini 1620.
And we believe that there is a close connection between this chalice and Christopher Jones, the captain of the Mayflower. We think that he may have made it as a gift. Wow. So it's one of our little treasures.
This is also where Christopher Jones's story ends, because he returned from the Mayflower expedition. He managed to get the Mayflower back across the Atlantic safely here to London. But just a couple of years later, he died, and he's buried here in this churchyard, within metres of where I'm standing now. We don't know where exactly, because time and tide, the passing of the centuries, means his grave is...
Dang it.
The RPG mobile hit of 20
has been lost.
Southampton.
They bought a ship, they bought the Speedwell in Holland, and they sailed to Southampton, where they met the Mayflower, which had been hired for the journey. And they were still negotiating terms where they were in Southampton.
Often it's suggested that Plymouth really welcomed the passengers of the Mayflower and the Speedwell. And there's certainly a suggestion that Plymouth was a Puritan town at this time. So the city had one church, which was St Andrew's, and the minister there was Henry Wallace. And he's often described as a Puritan preacher. And we also know at this time that banned puritanical texts were coming in to the town. So I think because we have that background, there is a feeling that the people who arrived here in late August, early September of 1620 were welcomed. I'm not so sure about that, because ultimately this group of people were still strangers. They had ambitions to cross the Atlantic, but at a terrible time of year. And Plymouth is a maritime city. Now, it was a working maritime town then. And I've always had the impression that probably people who lived in Plymouth in 1620 probably thought that these people were incredibly ambitious, possibly foolhardy, because they were attempting to cross the Atlantic at a truly terrible time. It was just too late in the year, because every seafarer in Plymouth knew that the best time to be on the New England coastline or the Newfoundland coastline was April or May. And that to attempt to make the crossing in the autumn was dangerous. Victorian imagery would have us believe that there were lots of people on the quayside. I think the scene might have been really very different, because actually we don't know how many people were in Plymouth. We know that 102 travelled, but we don't know how many were in the town.
They made several attempts to leave with two ships, but the Speedwell was found to be too leaky. It was described as being as leaky as a sieve. And while they went back to Plymouth to try and conduct repairs on it, the repairs were obviously not sufficiently good, and what they ended up doing was cramming on board the Mayflower.
But what you have is a group of people, men, women and children, all together on one deck of this ship. In height, they have about 5 feet. Each person has about a 6 foot space by about 3 foot, because the space that they're in is only about 75 feet long and about 25 feet wide. So if you divide that up by 102 people, different ages, different classes, different kinds of family. You have 19 family groups. So they divide up the space into almost makeshift cabins, I suppose. That's with canvas. But you've got people you've got families, you've got luggage, you've also got arms and armour, you've got a much smaller boat that is in bits also on this deck. So you've got a group of people who are brought together to travel in really, really challenging conditions.
The passengers embarked on the Mayflower just within metres of where I'm standing now, and I often think about what they must have been going through at that moment. They were leaving the country of their birth, the country they knew so well behind them, and they were heading out on a very perilous journey across the Atlantic at the wrong time of the year, and they would have known that. They would have presumably worried about the seaworthiness of the vessels they were in. Did they know about the speedwell's problems? Who knows? And also, what did they expect to find on the other side of this huge ocean?
But a great many of the people on board the Mayflower had probably never been at sea before, ever. And to suddenly be in an Atlantic storm, I mean, you know, the levels of kind of seasickness and just the sheer horror of it, it's hard to believe. I mean, most of these people couldn't swim, remember? I mean, you know, they knew that it would be completely fatal if they fell into the water.
One man, John Howland, is lost overboard and is pulled back from the water. Another man, William Button, dies within sight of land. One of the sailors, who many of the passengers didn't like very much at all, and who it sounds perhaps had baited some of them for a long time, he also dies during the journey. But I think one of the most significant events has to be...
At Radisson Hotels, health, safety, and security worldwide is one of our top priorities. That's why we have thoroughly reviewed all processes and enhanced our procedures, creating
a berth on board. 3 pregnant women travel, and Elizabeth Hopkins gives birth to a son on board. He's named Oceanus after the incredible ocean that they're endeavouring to conquer.
There must have been a sense of extraordinary excitement and elation at having seen the coast of a new continent for the first time after, as I say, over 2 months of being at sea and experiencing the conditions that they had. But what they did realise was that they were not in the part of America that they hoped to be.
They should have been a little bit further south where their patent, you know, which is the legal document that they take with them to officially, you know, in English eyes and European eyes, settle a particular part of North America.
They'd landed too far north because the storms had blown them off course a little. Initially they tried to sail south as far as the Hudson, but they found that too difficult to do, so they sailed south for a bit and then sailed north again.
So they were very much in the wrong place at the wrong time. But imagine what it would have been like seeing land after all that time. It also brought a challenge to them, because 64 days at sea, all together in one small space, inevitably had led to fractious relationships. And I think when they saw land, they realised that actually this journey was now real and that they had a potential to settle. But on this ship you had people with very different motivations, very different aspirations. And I think the difficulties had really started to come through. And so we get the descriptions of people arguing, disagreeing, and not being sure about what would happen next. So they come up with an agreement, which over time has become known as the Mayflower Compact. whether it was the beginning of self-governance in America or whether it was merely a pragmatic way of working together, is debatable. But what it gave them was a way of coming together, working together, and accepting that they were all in it together.
They spent months on this boat together in cramped quarters, and anyone that was not a pilgrim that was on that boat, the pilgrims just referred to as strangers. And it's like, how long can you call someone a stranger when you live that close to each other and rely on each other for all this? Which is why it's not surprising that the compact had to be signed, had to be drafted so quickly to keep the rebellion down within the Mayflower, and that it was not something that was signed by all men on the boat either.
When the ship arrives in Cape Cod in November of 1620, it's more of a hospital ship. People have not eaten well. People have not been outside. People probably haven't had enough to drink, certainly not fresh water. And lots of people were unwell. And I think how they were when they arrived also determines what they're able to do on arrival. And what they tell us is that people were sick. And actually, in many cases, they were dying.
So that's what conditions were like on the ship. But what about the native peoples that they would encounter, people like the Wampanoag? It's important to remember that for them, these Europeans wouldn't be the first that they'd met.
The village of Patuxet in 1614, we know that village was visited by John Smith and another boat that was in his fleet that was captained by Thomas Hunt. And that village, they estimate, probably had about 2,000 people living there at the time. Then after the Mayflower arrived, there was no one. They had succumbed to the Great Dying, the plague, which wiped out hundreds of thousands of people all along the coast. And the village of Patuxet had been, those who weren't killed had fled, so it was completely vacated.
You also had, between then and 1618, 1619, you had quite a few skirmishes.
Hi, I'm Jesse, and this is Flo, and we are Real-Time History. Over the past 6 years, we have been covering the first...
Very interesting.
With the Nauset tribe, which was located now in present time Provincetown or near Provincetown. And, those instances resulted in deaths on both the European side and on the native side as well.
When they see land, they realise they have to get to it. So they start to re-establish their small boat, which enables them to go out and do recce's, really, around this new landscape, which is unknown to them. And so what you have is a series of small explorations of about 6 to 8 men, led very often by their military captain, Miles Standish. And they go out to explore this new territory.
There's no written history from the Nauset side of that event, but we can know absolute with certainty that they were watching. You don't have a ship dock on your front yard and not take notice of it.
Before the Mayflower even set sail, disease has swept through this particular region, and the Wampanoag have been particularly affected by disease. And we know that Patuxet, which is the place where the Plymouth Colony is finally settled, had been a Native American village before that, a thriving Native American village, until that European contact, until the disease has spread through that area.
Obviously the Pilgrims looked at it as as an act of God that came through and allowed that village to be abandoned and wiped out due to the plague that had ripped through from 1616 to 1619. Obviously we don't look at that as an act of God, but more as a really dark point in the history of our people, where hundreds of thousands of Wampanoag were wiped out in the course of just 2 or 3 years. When they arrived at the village, all were gone, and they had to sweep away the bleached bones of the dead to make it habitable for them. That's to us shows just how quickly and how devastating that plague was that came through, because we did not have time to bury the bones of our dead. And there's estimates that 70 to 80% of the Wampanoag Nation died during 1616 to 1619. We had conflicts going on with our neighboring tribes as well, who now were looking at us as vulnerable and could expand their territory. So we had all of those things happening at that same point when the Pilgrims arrived. And I don't think that had those situations happened, that in 1620 the Pilgrims would have arrived on our shores and they would have been welcomed. We were in need. Our ancestors needed support. They needed an ally. So we make that assumption that is the backdrop to that sort of peaceful moment between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, because at that point the Pilgrims needed support. They were sick, they were hungry, they were cold, they were not in Virginia where they intended to be. And the Wampanoags, in the same respect, were depleted in our numbers and our resources, and we were being attacked by our neighbors. So you had two groups that needed each other at that particular moment in time in history.
So over the course of the first few months, we have English-speaking Indigenous people arrive in the colony. Samoset and Tisquantum, or Squanto as he's called. And with that ability to translate and to communicate, they begin to understand a little bit more about the Wampanoag, and there's a process of communication.
They speak English because they've been taken themselves, taken as slaves by some of those earlier explorers, brought back to Europe. They learn English on the way back. They manage to get themselves back, and so they're able to come up to the Pilgrims, speak to them, and they help them to survive in that first year and help them to establish crops.
So with the benefit of Indigenous interpreters and translators, they are able to establish a close alliance, I would say, with the Wampanoag people, and they begin to understand a little bit more, and they teach the colonists, how to survive, really. So if we go through the first year, and by November of 1621, a whole year later, they're taking in the first harvest, and they're taking in the first harvest because the Wampanoag have helped them do that.
The minute that the Europeans no longer needed that alliance, it quickly broke down. You had conflicts between both a Wampanoag government that was very much a democracy, where the leaders in the Wampanoag Nation answered to the people instead of reversal, where the people answered to a king or a queen. And it was also a matriarchal society as well, where women were often rising up to the highest level of government in the Wampanoag Nation. That would have definitely been a struggle for our Pilgrims to wrap their heads around. And they would not have enjoyed having to communicate on a government-to-government relationship with women. And that once that need on the European side had broken down, and once their new need was to expand their land base for their cattle, for their farms, it required them to further encroach on the land of the Wampanoags. And that's where you really started to see some conflicts and ultimately the King Philip's War.
King Philip's War is seen as Native America's last stand against colonialism in 1676. It is said to be the bloodiest war on U.S. soil, with the Native American community almost wiped out, with many abducted and enslaved. Ooh.
Being a descendant of the Mayflower passengers is still a big deal in the US, and I'm going to talk to one of them now, Professor Sarah Churchwell. She's going to explain to me what it means to be a descendant, how the story has been remembered and reinterpreted over the generations, and also how Thanksgiving has become a moment of national celebration in the US.
I have always been fascinated by that part of my family's history. I was raised to be interested in it. I was raised in a family that is interested in it, that is interested in American history generally. But the ways in which, you know, it's a funny thing when you're taught something in school as this thing that happened of historic importance, and then to go home and, you know, have your mother literally say to you, oh, but that's us, you know, you're descended directly from that. Particularly when you're young and impressionable, is kind of extraordinary. And so it absolutely shaped my sense of myself as an American, and certainly heightened my interest in history as, you know, as a young girl, but particularly in the mythologized aspects of American history, which I've always been really, really interested in. So when we now go back to reconsider our earlier and very simplistic and very Western European Anglo-orientated version of the histories, which basically says the Pilgrims came and they brought God and they brought civilization to the savages, which is the earliest version of it. And of course, that's the version that gets mythologized in Westerns and becomes, you know, incredibly, I mean, that's 19th century stories, but still the same logic that this civilization is being brought by the Europeans to the savages in the wilderness. As we have finally acknowledged that we need to considerably complicate that story, and that we're by no means the good guys in this story, and that obviously, as is always the case with histories of settler colonialism, you're talking about great violence, you're talking about the destruction of ways of life, about, you know, destruction of ancient religions and ancient languages and ancient cultures, and also ancient ways of inhabiting the environment. All of which has, you know, huge consequences for how we live today. And so that becomes a story about tension and a story about violence and a story about intercultural violence and indeed genocide when we get to the way that the European settlers eventually treated the natives. But at the beginning, they didn't, which is really quite a remarkable story.
The traditional way in which Mayflower, I think, has been commemorated over the years, especially the big milestone events like in 1970, the 350th, has concentrated on the birth of the nation myth, really, which was, you see it in oil paintings, Victorian oil paintings, of noble, righteous Christians going into the wilderness, bringing Christianity and the principles of democracy to found this great new nation, and on the way kind of befriend noble savages in terms of the natives there. And that really came unstuck badly, I think, in 1970, where in Massachusetts, the Wampanoag were invited actually to contribute to the ceremony, and the leader wanted to clearly say something, was asked what he was going to speak about, and gave his speech, and was told that he couldn't say that, and it needed to be censored.
For Frank James, he wasn't prepared to censor his speech, and, you know, the 350th commemoration wasn't ready to hear that speech. But what we found is today that everyone is prepared to tell that story accurately, and that was important for us.
We knew, as soon as we started to consider the notion of the importance of Mayflower, that if it was our event was going to have integrity and authenticity, then it had to speak of the whole range of historic narrative that's associated with that story. So the legacy of colonialism that followed on from it, and the legacy of the virtual annihilation of the Wampanoag nation 50 years later has to be told. And we weren't the people really to tell that, you know, how we don't have that authority. So the only way that we could, with integrity, make the ceremony truly inclusive of every historic dimension was to co-author an awful lot of the content with the Wampanoag community. And that's what basically we've been working on for the last 8 or 9 years.
In 2013, we originally sat down with Plymouth 400, which on this side is responsible for the organization of the major events around the commemoration. And we wanted to get a feel for how open they were going to be to telling the story as accurately as we understand it. And what came out of that was Plymouth 400 agreeing that yes, this story should be told from the perspective of Native Americans without censorship.
The 400th anniversary of the Mayflower is really an opportunity, I think, to reassess the past, to revisit it, and to genuinely think about our part in it. And I think what's been key to that is realising and acknowledging that this is a shared story, and it can only be told in a shared way. So, yes, it's an English story, but it's an American story, it's a Dutch story, but most crucially, it's a Native American story too. And I think the involvement of the Wampanoag people in this commemoration will define it. There has been no other commemoration of the Mayflower which has engaged them so readily as this one. They have given incredibly generously and courageously to this commemoration. And that means that we've been able to learn so much more, not just about their story, but our coexistence at this time, and the conflict, and the war, and the impact of colonization, even today. And that's incredibly important.
I'm often asked why, these historic traditions are so important and why we still carry on these traditions and cultures. And it's just, it's part of what makes us who we are. And I think that it's important for people to know that we are still here, yet, and we live in a contemporary way, but that we still treasure these parts of our tradition.
The approach that I've taken to this anniversary, and I hope has begun to come through both in events and in the way that we rethink this story, is to acknowledge this as a shared past. So I've mentioned already about access to knowledge through texts, but we also have to...
Hi, I'm Jesse, and this is Flo, and we are Real-Time History. Over the past 6 years, we have been covering
to have access through knowledge through the descendants of the Indigenous people who, are also part of this story, and other Indigenous groups too. So I think that's been really important to be able to set this as a shared narrative, telling these stories together rather than trying to separate them out artificially, as it were, because as soon as the Mayflower arrived, those legacies, those destinies were very much joined together.
I mean, what's great is that building on what's been achieved with the commemoration this year internationally, for the future, that's a foundation that everybody can build on. And whereas in the past, I think there were split histories, there was a kind of Wampanoag history that wasn't told here, and there was the Orthodox history. In the future, there's just one history. It's a shared history, warts and all, that we all own.
As an art historian, I think art has a huge role to play, because art can often express what words can't. I mean, after all, if we could write it down, we wouldn't make it into a form of art. No New Worlds is a sculptural installation in Plymouth Harbor. basically like a sign, and it's a phrase that has, it's huge. It's probably about, I don't know, 100 feet long and 50, 60 feet high. You know, it's massive, and it has lighted letters which spell out no new worlds. But at the same time, it's going to be able to change over the course of a day with different iterations, as they say. So it might say no worlds, it might say new worlds, it might say no worlds, no new worlds. And so it will shift between these different meanings, taking those words. And what was interesting, the artist told me the other day, is they were putting up the installation. People were walking by with seeing the new worlds and thinking, oh, yeah, new worlds. And then they put the no up. And then a whole new set of reactions and surprise.
This land
is remarkably ambitious, really. It's the first time, well, the Wampanoag have never been involved in theatrical performance. It's not an art form they're involved in, so they've been very brave in kind of signing up for this. But to have two large communities on either side of the Atlantic working together, that's never happened before.
So I think that this land is just going to be a phenomenal experience. Yes, it is going to be a theatrical event, but I think that it's just going to be a really exciting opportunity for people to come together and experience something that is about being a human being.
The Box is Plymouth's new cultural centre for 2020 and beyond. It's very much a legacy of the Mayflower anniversary. It's a museum, it's a gallery, it's an archive, and much more beside. And we've been working on the
Doggone it.
Mayflower 400 Legend and Legacy exhibition for 3 years. It's a co-curated exhibition with the Wampanoag people, and we've been so pleased and so grateful to welcome their story to it, because it means that we've been able to place the Mayflower story in a much, much wider context. But finding the objects which enable us to illustrate a 400-year relationship has been quite challenging. So we've worked with 100 museums, libraries and archives across the UK, the US and the Netherlands as well, to bring in about 300 objects that reflect different aspects of the story, different perspectives of this history, and different ways in.
But seeing them, you know, live and in person here is a whole different thing. And it just, you know, has allowed me to get that much closer to look at them, and to just to be with them and spend time with them has been extremely meaningful.
But this commemoration is not just being marked by art and cultural projects. There is a very, very exciting scientific legacy to this 400th. It's called the Mayflower Autonomous Ship, MASS for short. It's a ship of the future designed to help scientists collect data and protect the health of the ocean. It's not a replica, and with its AI and cutting-edge technology, it has more in common with a modern business than its 17th century namesake. But it does carry the Mayflower name, and it's inspired by the pioneering spirit of the original voyage. To help commemorate the 400th anniversary of the famous voyage, a naming ceremony for MASS was held in Plymouth, near the Mayflower Steps, 400 years to the day that the original ship set sail. When it eventually heads out on its journey, it will become one of the first full-sized, fully autonomous vessels to cross the Atlantic. The mission will further the development of autonomous ships of all shapes and sizes and help transform the future of marine research.
Well, not too autonomous, because of hackers, you know.
Well, that's it for this week's History Hit Live. I think we've learned that the voyage of the Mayflower is much more than just that, just the journey of a ship from one side of the Atlantic to another. It's a tale with universal ideas and values around freedom of thought and expression, around migration, colonisation and exploitation. We've tried to remember it warts and all, to give a more honest and historically researched view of the events 400 years ago. Who knows how they'll commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Mayflower in 100 years' time. Sadly, I will not be here in Plymouth to see that. Join us next week on History Hit Live. We're moving back to Fridays. See you then.
So it's basically this, presented by Dan Snow, produced and directed by Joe Greenway, production manager Laura McMullen, shot and edited by Oliver McNicklin, images and music Almi Pond 5, with thanks to Smokey General Studios. Thanks to
They don't care where you're from. They don't care who you marry. Pets don't care about.
Executive producer James Carson. History Hit. Oh, so what'd you think of the video? So what'd you think? Pretty informed? It's pretty informative, huh? And right now, my dog Digger's getting on my nerves. What would you think? What'd you think of the video? If you liked it, be sure to hit that like button. Click subscribe to my channel, and be sure to click on that little bell icon to be notified of future uploads. It was pretty interesting. Not exactly how I pictured it myself, you know. But what the heck? Ali? I'll leave some more Mayflower stuff in the end screen annotation, and maybe even the original. Right now, I've only got 3 minutes left till this video, before this video stops recording. So I thought it was pretty good. I guess they improvised because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think anyway. But I gotta. And right now, my dog's starting to get on my nerves. And ugh. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Oh yeah, I already said like, comment, subscribe. Make sure to leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. And leave a comment down below if I should do more videos like this, or if I should include my dog Digger in more videos. More videos. He's starting to get up. Anyway, if you do one of them or manage to do them all, I would greatly appreciate it. But until then, say bye, Digger. Oh. Everyone say bye to Digger. Bye. Happy 400th anniversary on the Mayflower Day. All right. Now to close out. Happy 400 years on from Mayflower Day. And until next time. Until the next reaction video. This is Jeffrey Bartell signing off.